In the frozen wastelands of Eastern Europe during World War II, where death stalked every shadow and hope seemed as distant as spring, one woman's simple act of bringing food to hungry soldiers would trigger a chain of events that military historians still study today. What began as a routine supply run through enemy territory would end with the complete annihilation of an entire German division, all because Maria Volkov refused to let her people starve. They called it the miracle of Stalingrad's sister, though it happened 300 miles away from that famous battle. But unlike Stalingrad, this victory wasn't won by armies or tanks or superior strategy. It was won by a 28-year-old seamstress from a village so small it didn't appear on most maps, who stumbled upon intelligence so valuable that it would reshape the entire Eastern Front. This is her story, a story of how courage, cunning, and an unbreakable will to survive can change the course of history. It's the story of how Maria Volkov went from being just another face in the crowd to becoming the woman who single-handedly destroyed the Wehrmacht's most elite fighting force. Maria Volkov had always been good with her hands. In the small village of Krasny Bor, nestled between rolling hills and dense pine forests, her skill with needle and thread had kept her family fed, even when the harvest failed. But in the winter of 1942, her hands would do much more than mend clothes. They would help turn the tide of war. The morning started like any other during those dark months. The German army had swept through the region like a plague of locusts, taking everything of value and leaving behind only fear and empty stomachs. The local resistance fighters, a ragtag group of former soldiers and desperate villagers, had been hiding in the forests for weeks, launching small attacks on supply convoys and communication lines. They were running out of food, ammunition, and hope. Maria wrapped her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she prepared the meager supplies she had managed to gather. 3 loaves of black bread, still warm from her neighbor's oven, a small wheel of cheese that old Mrs. Petrov had somehow kept hidden from the German search parties, 2 bottles of vodka that her late husband had buried in their garden before marching off to war, never to return. It wasn't much, but it was all she could spare without arousing suspicion. The forest path was treacherous in winter, especially with fresh snow covering the hidden roots and rocks that could easily twist an ankle or worse. Maria had walked this route dozens of times as a child, picking berries and mushrooms with her grandmother, but never under such dangerous circumstances. Every snapping twig could signal an approaching patrol. Every shadow between the trees could hide an enemy soldier. She moved carefully, using the techniques her brother Pavel had taught her before he joined the partisans. Step lightly, avoid patches of fresh snow where footprints would be obvious. Stay close to the tree line where the canopy would break up her silhouette. The canvas bag on her back felt heavier with each step, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, the difference between her people living another day or slowly starving to death. Halfway to the partisan camp, Maria heard voices ahead. She dropped to her knees behind a fallen log, heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Through the snow-laden branches, she could see the distinctive grey uniforms of German soldiers, 3 of them standing around what looked like a small communication device. They were speaking in low voices, occasionally gesturing toward a map spread on a tree stump. Maria's German was limited to a few phrases she had picked up from overheard conversations in the village, but she could make out enough to understand they were discussing troop movements. One of the soldiers, a young officer with lieutenant's stripes, was pointing to different locations on the map, while another took notes in a small leather notebook. She should have turned back. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But something about their behavior struck her as odd. Why would 3 soldiers be out here alone, so far from the main roads? And why were they being so secretive about their conversation, even though they believed themselves to be in secure territory? Maria made a decision that would change everything. Instead of retreating, she worked her way closer, using every bit of forest craft she had learned as a child. She crawled on her belly through the snow, ignoring the cold that seeped through her clothes and numbed her fingers. The canvas bag made movement difficult, but she managed to position herself close enough to hear most of their conversation. What she heard made her blood run cold. The Germans weren't just discussing routine patrol routes or supply lines, they were planning something massive. From the fragments of conversation she could understand, combined with their gestures toward the map, she realized they were coordinating a major offensive that would trap the main body of partisan fighters in a 3-pronged attack. The operation was scheduled to begin at dawn the next day. The lieutenant folded the map and tucked it inside his uniform jacket right next to his heart. He gave orders to his companions in rapid German, then checked his watch. Maria caught the word "Kommandant" and realized with growing horror that this officer was returning to the main German base to finalize the attack plans. If he reached his destination, dozens of partisan fighters would walk into a carefully prepared ambush. As the three soldiers prepared to leave, Maria faced the most difficult decision of her life. She could continue to the partisan camp and warn them about the impending attack, but by the time she arrived and they managed to organize a response, the German officer would have already delivered his intelligence. The attack would proceed as planned, just with the partisans knowing they were walking into a trap. Or she could try to stop the officer herself. Maria had never killed anyone. She had never even held a weapon more dangerous than a kitchen knife. But as she watched the young German lieutenant adjust his jacket over the map that spelled doom for her friends and neighbors, she felt something harden inside her chest. This wasn't about courage or heroism, it was about survival. Not just her own, but that of everyone she cared about. The officer took point as the three Germans began moving through the forest, following a path that would take them roughly parallel to Maria's original route. She shadowed them, staying far enough back to avoid detection but close enough to keep them in sight. Her mind raced as she tried to formulate a plan. The canvas bag on her back suddenly felt different. Not heavier, but more significant. Among the food she was carrying was one of her grandmother's old kitchen knives, wrapped in cloth to prevent it from damaging the other supplies. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was sharp, and she knew how to use it. The three soldiers moved with the casual confidence of men who believed they owned the forest. They talked quietly among themselves, occasionally laughing at some shared joke. The lieutenant in particular seemed relaxed, probably thinking about the promotion that would surely come after delivering such valuable intelligence to his commanders. Maria's opportunity came when they reached a narrow creek that cut across the forest floor. The water was partially frozen, creating a natural bottleneck where the path narrowed between two large boulders. The lieutenant's companions crossed first, testing the ice carefully before proceeding. The lieutenant followed, but he was heavier than the others, and Maria heard the ice crack ominously under his weight. He made it across, but just barely. The near fall had left him shaken and off balance. More importantly, it had separated him from his companions by several yards as they waited on the far side for him to regain his footing. Maria moved without conscious thought, her body acting on instincts she didn't know she possessed. She emerged from behind the boulder like a wraith, the kitchen knife already in her hand. The lieutenant saw her at the last second, his eyes widening in surprise rather than fear. He probably thought she was just another desperate villager begging for food or mercy. The knife slid between his ribs with surprising ease, finding the gap in his winter coat and uniform jacket. He opened his mouth to cry out, but Maria's free hand clamped over his lips, muffling the sound. They fell together onto the snowy bank of the creek, the lieutenant's body convulsing once before going still. The whole encounter had taken less than 30 seconds, but to Maria it felt like hours. She could hear his companions calling to him from the other side of the creek, their voices tinged with mild concern, but not yet alarm. They probably assumed he was still struggling with the treacherous crossing. Working with desperate speed, Maria rifled through the dead officer's jacket until she found the map. It was more detailed than she had expected, covered with military symbols and notations in German script. She couldn't read most of it, but she could see the arrows indicating attack routes and the circles marking partisan positions. The Germans knew far more about resistance activities than anyone had suspected. She also found the leather notebook, filled with pages of neat German handwriting. There were other documents too, orders, supply manifests. What looked like a complete organizational chart of German forces in the region. The lieutenant had been carrying enough intelligence to give the partisans a devastating advantage, if they could act on it quickly enough. The voices from across the creek were getting more urgent. Maria folded the map and stuffed it inside her own coat, along with the notebook and other documents. She retrieved her knife, wiping it clean on the lieutenant's uniform before wrapping it in cloth again. Then she began the delicate process of hiding the body. The creek bank was muddy and partially frozen, but she managed to drag the lieutenant's corpse behind a cluster of dead reeds. It wouldn't hide him forever, but it might buy her a few precious hours before his companions organized a proper search. She scattered snow over the drag marks in the small pool of blood, doing her best to eliminate obvious signs of struggle. By the time the German soldiers decided to cross back over the creek to look for their missing officer, Maria was already moving through the forest at a pace that would have impressed her partisan friends. She no longer worried about leaving tracks or making noise. Speed was more important than stealth now. The partisan camp was still 2 miles away through difficult terrain, but Maria covered the distance in record time, driven by adrenaline and the knowledge that dozens of lives depended on her reaching them before dawn. When she finally stumbled into the hidden clearing where the resistance fighters had made their temporary base, she was exhausted, frozen, and covered in blood that wasn't her own. The sentry who challenged her was Pavel, her younger brother. His face went white when he saw her condition, and he immediately called for the camp commander, a grizzled former Red Army sergeant named Dmitry Volkov, who had no relation to Maria despite sharing her surname. Within minutes, she was sitting by a small fire, wrapped in blankets, and trying to explain what had happened while Dmitry and his lieutenants studied the captured German documents. The map was even more valuable than Maria had realized. It showed not just the planned attack on their current position, but the locations of 3 other partisan camps, German supply depots, communication centers, and troop concentrations throughout the entire region. The notebook contained detailed intelligence about German capabilities, including the fact that they were severely undermanned and relying heavily on psychological warfare to maintain control. Most importantly, the documents revealed that the German commander responsible for anti-partisan operations, Oberst Heinrich Müller, was due to arrive at a forward command post the next evening to personally oversee the final phase of the campaign against the resistance. He would be traveling with minimal security, confident that his location remained secret. Dmitry looked up from the captured papers with something that might have been a smile. For the first time in months, the partisans had a chance to go on the offensive instead of just reacting to German moves. But they would need to move fast, and they would need to be absolutely ruthless about it. Maria found herself at the center of the planning session that followed. Her detailed description of the German patrol route, combined with her intimate knowledge of the local terrain, made her an invaluable resource. More than that, her actions had demonstrated a capacity for violence and strategic thinking that impressed even the veteran fighters. When Dmitry asked if she would guide a strike team to intercept other German patrols and gather more intelligence, Maria didn't hesitate. She had crossed a line that morning, and there was no going back. The frightened seamstress who had set out to deliver food to hungry partisans no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, more dangerous, and absolutely committed to making the German occupiers pay for what they had done to her homeland. As the partisan fighters prepared their weapons and discussed tactics, Maria sat quietly by the fire, studying the captured German map by flickering candlelight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. The intelligence she had gathered would give them the element of surprise, but success would depend on their ability to coordinate multiple simultaneous attacks across a wide area. She thought about the young German lieutenant whose life she had taken. He had seemed so confident, so certain of his superiority. In a way, his arrogance had been his downfall. The German army had become so used to easy victories that they had grown careless about security. They moved through occupied territory like tourists, never considering that a simple village woman might pose a lethal threat. That carelessness would cost them dearly. Maria had given the partisans more than just tactical intelligence. She had given them hope. For the first time since the occupation began, they had reason to believe they could strike a decisive blow against their oppressors. But even as she planned for the battles ahead, Maria couldn't shake the memory of the moment when her knife had found its target. The sensation had been disturbingly easy, almost natural. She wondered what that said about her, about the person she was becoming. The war was changing everyone, turning farmers into fighters, mothers into killers, neighbors into enemies. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the dark canopy above. Around her, the partisan fighters continued their preparations, cleaning weapons, studying maps, discussing strategy. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to live with constant danger. But Maria could sense a new energy in their movements. The intelligence she had captured had transformed them from desperate survivors into hunters. She pulled her grandmother's knife from its cloth wrapping and held it up to catch the firelight. The blade was still clean, showing no trace of the violence it had committed. Tomorrow, she suspected, it would taste blood again. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it brought a cold satisfaction. The Germans had started this war, but she was going to help finish it. Dawn came too early and too cold, painting the snow-covered forest in shades of grey and blue that reminded Maria of death. She had slept poorly, haunted by dreams of the German lieutenant's face in his final moments, but she felt more alert than she had in months. The captured intelligence had given them a narrow window of opportunity, and they couldn't afford to waste it. Dmitry had spent the night organizing 3 separate strike teams, each with a specific target based on the information from the German documents. The largest group, led by Pavel, would move to intercept a supply convoy that was scheduled to pass through the valley road at midday. A second team would attack a communication outpost that coordinated patrol activities across the region. Dmitri himself would lead the third team in an attempt to capture Oberst Müller when he arrived at the forward command post. Maria had been assigned to the most dangerous mission of all. She would work alone, using her knowledge of local terrain and her proven ability to move undetected through enemy territory to gather additional intelligence and eliminate any German patrols that might interfere with the main operations. It was a task that required someone who could think quickly, act decisively, and kill without hesitation. The realization that she had become such a person still felt strange to Maria. 3 days ago, her biggest concern had been whether she could find enough flour to bake bread for her neighbors. Now she was strapping a captured German pistol to her waist and planning to hunt enemy soldiers through the forest like a wolf stalking prey. The pistol had belonged to the lieutenant she had killed. It was a Walther P-38, still loaded with 7 rounds of ammunition. Dmitri had shown her how to use it properly, though he warned her that gunshots would alert every German patrol within miles. The knife would remain her primary weapon, silent and deadly. Maria's first target was a 2-man patrol that, according to the captured documents, checked a series of listening posts every morning at roughly the same time. These posts were hidden observation points where the Germans monitored partisan radio communications and tracked resistance movements. Eliminating the patrol would blind the enemy to partisan activities for several crucial hours. She found them exactly where the intelligence had indicated, following a predictable route through a section of forest that had been thinned by German logging operations. The 2 soldiers moved with the mechanical precision of men following a routine they had performed dozens of times before. They chatted quietly as they walked, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders, clearly not expecting any trouble. Maria shadowed them for nearly a mile, studying their habits and waiting for the right moment to strike. The older soldier, a corporal with sergeant's stripes, seemed alert and experienced. He occasionally paused to scan the forest around them and kept his hand near his weapon. The younger one, barely out of his teens by the look of him, was more interested in complaining about the cold and speculating about what they might have for lunch. The opportunity came when they stopped to check one of the listening posts, a camouflage shelter built into a natural depression near a frozen stream. While the corporal examined the radio equipment inside, the young soldier stood guard outside, but his attention was focused on trying to light a cigarette with matches that kept going out in the wind. Maria emerged from behind a snow-covered pine tree like a ghost, moving with the silent grace of a natural predator. Her knife found the young soldier's throat before he even realized she was there. He dropped without a sound, the unlit cigarette falling from his lips to land in the snow beside his body. The corporal heard something, perhaps the soft thud of his companion's body hitting the ground, and emerged from the shelter with his rifle ready. He was well-trained and experienced, but he was also looking for an external threat, not expecting an enemy to already be inside his perimeter. Maria was waiting for him. The German pistol felt heavy and unfamiliar in her hands, but at close range it didn't matter. The shot echoed through the forest like thunder, sending birds exploding from the trees in all directions. The corporal spun around and fell, his rifle clattering across the frozen ground. She worked quickly to search the bodies and the listening post. The radio equipment was too complex for her to operate, but she could certainly disable it. A few solid blows with the butt of the captured rifle smashed the delicate vacuum tubes and dials beyond repair. She also found detailed maps showing the locations of all the listening posts in the area, along with radio frequencies and call signs. More importantly, she discovered that the Germans had been monitoring partisan communications far more effectively than anyone had suspected. They had transcripts of radio conversations, detailed notes about resistance activities, even rough sketches of several partisan fighters, based on eyewitness reports from collaborators in the villages. The intelligence was sobering, but it also presented an opportunity. If the partisans could feed false information through the compromised radio network, they might be able to mislead the Germans about their true intentions and capabilities. Maria carefully folded the radio transcripts and frequency lists into her coat, adding them to her growing collection of captured intelligence. The sound of the gunshot would have been heard for miles, so Maria couldn't linger at the scene. She dragged both bodies into the shelter and collapsed part of the roof to hide them, then moved quickly toward her next objective. According to the captured documents, there was a German supply cache hidden in an abandoned farmhouse about 3 miles to the east. It was lightly guarded and contained medical supplies, ammunition, and food that the partisans desperately needed. The farmhouse stood in a small clearing that had once been a prosperous homestead. The buildings were largely intact, but the fields were overgrown with weeds and young saplings. Maria could see the remains of a vegetable garden, now buried under snow. and the skeleton of a barn that had been burned during the initial German advance. 2 German soldiers were visible near the main house, both smoking cigarettes and stamping their feet to keep warm. They had built a small fire in a metal drum and were taking turns warming their hands over it. Their rifles leaned against the side of the house, close enough to reach quickly, but far enough away to suggest they weren't expecting immediate trouble. Maria spent 20 minutes studying the scene, looking for additional guards or signs of a trap. The Germans had grown careless over the months of occupation, but they weren't stupid. A supply cache would normally be better protected than this. She began to suspect that the real guards might be inside the house, staying warm while their companions maintained a token watch outside. Her suspicions proved correct when she circled around to observe the back of the farmhouse. Through a partially boarded window, she could see the glow of lamplight and occasionally glimpse the shadows of moving figures. Based on the amount of smoke coming from the chimney and the number of footprints in the snow around the house, she estimated there were at least 4 or 5 additional soldiers inside. This was too many enemies for a direct assault, especially in an open area where she would have no cover. Maria decided on a different approach. She would use the Germans' own carelessness against them. Working her way back through the forest, she gathered dry branches, dead leaves, and anything else that would burn easily. It took her nearly an hour to collect enough material, but she managed to assemble several bundles of kindling that she could carry without making too much noise. The plan was simple but effective. She would set fires around the perimeter of the farmhouse, creating enough smoke and confusion to force the Germans outside, where she could pick them off one by one. It wasn't elegant, but it would work if she executed it properly. Maria placed her first fire bundle against the side of the barn, using matches taken from the dead German soldier to get it started. The dry wood caught quickly, and soon flames were climbing up the weathered siding. She moved to the next position, a small outbuilding that might have been a chicken coop, and repeated the process. By the time she lit the third fire, the Germans had noticed the smoke. She could hear shouting from inside the farmhouse and see figures moving frantically past the windows. The 2 guards outside had abandoned their warm fire and were running around, trying to determine where the new fires were coming from. Maria positioned herself behind a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, the German pistol ready in her hands. She had 6 rounds left, which should be enough if she made every shot count. The rifle she had taken from the listening post was propped beside her as backup, though she wasn't entirely sure she could operate it effectively. The first German soldier to emerge from the farmhouse was carrying a fire extinguisher and running toward the burning barn. Maria's first shot took him in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the snow. The extinguisher bounced away, releasing a cloud of white foam that quickly dissipated in the cold air. The remaining Germans reacted with professional speed, taking cover and trying to locate the source of the gunfire. But the smoke from the fires was beginning to obscure visibility, and Maria had chosen her position well. She was concealed behind solid cover with clear fields of fire toward all the buildings. Her second shot caught one of the original guards as he tried to reach his rifle. The bullet shattered his shoulder and sent him spinning away from the weapon, screaming and clutching at the wound. Maria's third shot finished him off, the mercy of a quick death in a situation where mercy was a luxury neither side could afford. The surviving Germans had found cover now and were beginning to return fire, but they were shooting blind through the smoke. Maria could hear bullets whining overhead and thudding into the log that sheltered her, but none came dangerously close. She took careful aim and fired again, rewarded by a cry of pain from the direction of the farmhouse. The smoke was getting thicker now, and she could see flames beginning to spread to the main house itself. If there were supplies inside, she needed to retrieve them before the whole structure burned. But first, she had to finish dealing with the remaining Germans. Maria worked her way around the clearing, using the smoke as cover to get closer to the farmhouse. She could hear at least 2 Germans inside coughing and shouting to each other in panicked German. The fire was spreading faster than they had expected, and they were trapped between the flames and an enemy they couldn't see. When the first German soldier stumbled out of the smoke-filled farmhouse, gasping and half-blinded, Maria was waiting for him. Her knife slid between his ribs with the same efficient precision she had learned that morning. He collapsed without making a sound, adding his blood to the snow that was already stained red around the burning buildings. The last German soldier was either very brave or very desperate. Instead of fleeing, he charged towards Maria's position, firing his rifle from the hip and screaming what sounded like curses in his native language. It was a courageous last stand, but courage without accuracy was usually fatal in warfare. Maria's final pistol shot took him in the head, ending his charge and his life simultaneously. He fell forward into the snow just a few feet from where she crouched. his rifle sliding away across the ice. The clearing fell silent, except for the crackling of flames and the occasional crash as burning timber collapsed inside the buildings. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the fires made it impossible to enter the farmhouse safely. Maria ran toward the building, pulling her coat over her face to filter the worst of the smoke. The heat was already intense, and she could hear the ominous groaning of wooden beams under stress. The interior of the farmhouse was a maze of smoke and dancing shadows. Maria found the supply cache in what had been the main bedroom, stacked in wooden crates and canvas bags. There were medical supplies, boxes of ammunition for various German weapons, emergency rations, and several bottles of schnapps that would be welcome additions to partisan morale. She couldn't carry everything, so she focused on the most valuable items. Medical supplies that could save partisan lives, ammunition for weapons they already possessed, and a few bottles of the schnapps because she knew how much the fighters would appreciate them. Everything else would have to burn with the house. As she prepared to leave, Maria noticed something that made her pause. Hidden under a loose floorboard was a metal box containing more documents, including what appeared to be a complete roster of German collaborators in the surrounding villages. These were local people who had been providing information to the occupying forces in exchange for food, protection, or other favors. The list contained names she recognized, people she had known all her life. Some of the revelations were shocking, others merely confirmed suspicions that had been circulating for months. But all of them represented security threats to the partisan network. This intelligence was potentially as valuable as everything else she had captured combined. The heat was becoming unbearable, and smoke was making it difficult to breathe. Maria stuffed the collaborator list inside her coat, along with the other captured documents, shouldered the bag of supplies she had selected, and fought her way back through the smoke-filled house to the outside world. The entire homestead was now ablaze, sending a pillar of black smoke high into the grey winter sky. The fire would be visible for miles, and would certainly attract German attention. But it would also serve as a signal to partisan units across the region, letting them know that the offensive had begun. Maria cached the supplies in a hidden location she could find again later, keeping only the documents and a small amount of medical supplies that she could carry without being slowed down. She still had hours of work ahead of her before the day was over. According to her calculations, Pavel's team should be preparing their ambush of the supply convoy about now. Dmitri's group would be positioning themselves near the German command post, where they hoped to capture or kill Oberst Müller. Both operations depended on the enemy remaining ignorant of partisan capabilities and intentions for a few more hours. But the smoke from the burning farmhouse would alert every German patrol in the area that something was happening. Radio calls would go out, reserves would be mobilized, security would be tightened. The element of surprise that had been their greatest advantage was rapidly disappearing. Maria needed to buy her friends more time, and she knew exactly how to do it. The documents she had captured included patrol schedules and communication protocols for the entire region. She knew where German units would be and when they would be there. More importantly, she knew how to make them waste time and resources chasing shadows instead of reinforcing the areas where real partisan attacks were taking place. She checked the captured pistol and found she was down to her last 2 rounds. The rifle she had taken from the listing post was still functional, though she wasn't entirely comfortable with its unfamiliar mechanisms. Her grandmother's knife was as sharp as ever, and she was beginning to think of it as her most reliable weapon. The next phase of her personal war against the German occupation was about to begin. Instead of reactive survival, she was now engaged in active hunting. The prey had become the predator, and the forest that had once sheltered her from enemy patrols would now help her stalk them. As Maria moved through the burning landscape she had created, she felt the final transformation from frightened villager to deadly partisan completing itself. There would be no going back to her old life, even if the war ended tomorrow. She had discovered something inside herself that she hadn't known existed, a capacity for violence and strategic thinking that made her as dangerous as any trained soldier. The German occupiers had created their own worst nightmare without realizing it. By pushing ordinary people beyond the limits of endurance, they had turned seamstresses into killers, farmers into saboteurs, and entire communities into resistance networks. Maria was just one example of what happened when survival instincts merged with righteous anger and strategic intelligence. The smoke from the burning farmhouse continued to rise into the winter sky, visible for miles in every direction. It was both a warning and a promise, a warning to the German forces that their period of easy domination was ending, and a promise to the occupied people that resistance was not only possible but effective. Maria disappeared into the forest like a ghost, leaving behind only death, destruction, and the growing realization among German commanders that they were no longer hunting scattered refugees. They were being hunted by someone who understood their weaknesses better than they understood them themselves. The afternoon sun hung low over the forest, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like dark fingers across the snow. Maria had been moving for hours, using the captured German intelligence to stay ahead of the search parties that were now combing the region. The smoke from the burning farmhouse had done exactly what she had hoped. It had drawn German reserves away from the areas where Pavel and Dmitri were conducting their operations. But Maria's work was far from over. Hidden in her coat were documents that could reshape the entire resistance effort in the region, if she could get them to the right people. The collaborator list alone was worth its weight in gold, but there were other prizes as well. Detailed maps of German positions, supply schedules, communication codes, and most importantly, the complete battle plan for Oberst Muller's final offensive against the partisans. She had been tracking a German patrol for the last hour, staying just out of sight while they followed what they thought was her trail through the forest. There were 6 soldiers in this group, led by a veteran sergeant who knew his business. They moved carefully, watching for ambushes and maintaining good spacing between individuals. Under normal circumstances, they would have been far too dangerous for one person to engage. But these were not normal circumstances. Maria had advantages that no German patrol could match. Intimate knowledge of the terrain, detailed intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions, and most importantly, the desperate determination of someone fighting for the survival of everything she held dear. The patrol was following a false trail that Maria had deliberately laid, leading them away from the actual partisan positions and toward a section of forest where she could control the engagement. There was an old hunting blind that her father had built years before the war, positioned on a hillside that offered excellent fields of fire across a natural clearing. If she could lure the Germans into that clearing, she might be able to eliminate them all before they could call for reinforcements. Maria reached the hunting blind just as the winter sun began to sink below the tree line. The structure was partially collapsed, but still solid enough to provide cover and concealment. More importantly, her father had cached supplies here years ago, including an old hunting rifle with a telescopic sight and several boxes of ammunition. The rifle was a pre-war model, designed for taking down deer and elk rather than enemy soldiers. But it would serve her purposes well enough. Maria checked the mechanism carefully, loaded 5 rounds into the magazine, and settled into position to wait for the German patrol. She had perhaps 30 minutes of daylight left, which should be enough time to finish what she had started. The Germans entered the clearing exactly where she had expected them to, following the false trail with textbook precision. They spread out into a defensive formation, but they were still thinking like hunters rather than prey. The sergeant sent 2 men to check the far side of the clearing while he and the other 3 examined the tracks Maria had left in the snow. Her first shot took the sergeant in the chest, the heavy hunting bullet spinning him around and dropping him into the snow like a felled tree. The other Germans reacted instantly, diving for cover and trying to locate the source of the gunfire. But Maria had chosen her position well. The hunting blind was perfectly camouflaged and positioned at an elevation that made it nearly impossible to spot from the clearing below. Her second shot caught one of the Germans who was trying to flank her position, hitting him in the shoulder and sending him tumbling down a small embankment. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight, screaming and thrashing in the snow while his companions tried to decide whether to help him or continue seeking cover from the unseen sniper. The remaining Germans were well trained and disciplined. Instead of panicking, they began to coordinate their response, using hand signals to communicate while maintaining defensive positions. One soldier provided covering fire while another moved to a better position. It was exactly the kind of professional response that made German infantry so formidable. But Maria had been studying German tactics for months, learning from captured documents and prisoner interrogations how their forces operated. She knew that their standard response to sniper fire was to fix the shooter's position and then flank it from multiple directions. The problem was that she wasn't going to stay in one position long enough for their tactics to work. She fired her third shot and immediately rolled away from the hunting blind, using the terrain to mask her movement. The bullet took another German soldier in the leg, sending him crashing into a fallen log with a cry of pain. Then Maria was moving, working her way around the edge of the clearing to a new firing position. The Germans were now shooting at the hunting blind, concentrating their fire on where they thought she was hidden. It was a reasonable tactical response, but they were firing at empty air, while the real threat circled around behind them like a wolf stalking a wounded elk. Maria's fourth shot came from a completely unexpected direction, hitting one of the remaining soldiers in the back as he tried to advance on her former position. The man pitched forward into the snow, his rifle flying away across the frozen ground. That left only 2 Germans still in the fight, and they were beginning to show signs of panic. One of them broke cover and ran toward the trees, probably hoping to reach a position where he could use his radio to call for support. Maria tracked him through the telescopic sight and squeezed the trigger, but the shot went wide, splintering bark from a pine tree just inches from his head. She had 1 round left in the magazine, and no time to reload before the surviving Germans reached cover. Maria abandoned the hunting rifle and drew the German pistol she had taken from her first victim. At close range, the handgun would be more effective than trying to operate an unfamiliar bolt-action rifle. She moved quickly through the forest, using every bit of cover available to close the distance with her remaining enemies. She found the wounded German soldier first, the one she had hit in the shoulder. He was trying to crawl toward the tree line, leaving a trail of blood in the snow behind him. When he saw Maria approaching, he reached for his sidearm with his good hand. But she was faster. The pistol shot echoed through the forest, and another enemy fell silent forever. The last German soldier had reached the radio and was frantically trying to contact his headquarters. Maria could hear him speaking rapidly in German, reporting contact with partisan forces and requesting immediate reinforcement. She had perhaps minutes before German reserves arrived at the scene. She approached carefully, using the sound of his radio transmission to mask her footsteps. The soldier was crouched behind a large boulder, his attention focused on the radio rather than the forest around him. It was a fatal mistake. Maria's knife found the base of his skull, severing the spinal cord instantly. He collapsed forward over the radio, his final transmission cut off in mid-sentence. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of wind through the pine trees and her own rapid breathing. She quickly searched the bodies, collecting weapons, ammunition, and any documents that might be useful. The radio was still functional, and she could hear German voices calling for the patrol to respond. Soon they would send search parties to investigate, and the forest would be crawling with enemy soldiers. But Maria had accomplished her primary objective. The German reserves that should have been reinforcing their positions against Pavel and Dmitri's attacks were instead being drawn into the forest to hunt for a single sniper who had already disappeared. Every soldier chasing her through the trees was one less defending the targets that really mattered. She cached the extra weapons and ammunition where partisan fighters could retrieve them later, then began moving toward the rendezvous point where she was supposed to meet Dmitri's team. According to the original plan, they should have completed their mission against the German command post by now, either capturing or killing Oberst Müller and his staff. The sound of distant gunfire suggested that the battle was still ongoing. As Maria worked her way through the forest toward the sound, she began to hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire, punctuated by the heavier thump of grenades and automatic weapons. Whatever was happening at the command post, it was more than just a quick raid. She reached a ridge overlooking the German position just as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her uncomfortably of the fires she had started earlier. Below her, the forward command post was a scene of chaos and destruction. The German position had been built around a large farmhouse similar to the one Maria had burned, but this structure was intact and heavily fortified. Sandbags surrounded the buildings, machine gun nests covered the approaches, and communication antennas reached up from the roof like skeletal fingers. Under normal circumstances, it would have been nearly impossible for partisan fighters to assault such a position successfully. But these were not normal circumstances. Dmitri's attack had been perfectly timed to coincide with the arrival of Oberst Müller and his staff, catching the German defenders in the middle of a command conference. More importantly, the diversionary attacks that Maria and Pavel had launched earlier in the day had drawn away most of the reserve forces that would normally have reinforced the command post. From her vantage point on the ridge, Maria could see partisan fighters advancing on the German position from 3 different directions, using the captured intelligence to avoid the strongest defensive positions and attack the enemy's weakest points. The machine gun nests that should have been covering the approaches had been neutralized by precise rifle fire, and the German defenders were falling back toward the main building. But something was wrong. Maria counted the partisan fighters she could see, and there were far fewer than there should have been. Dmitri's team had started with 15 men, but she could only identify 8 or 9 figures moving through the German positions. Either the assault had been more costly than expected, or some of the attackers were already inside the main building. She was about to work her way down the ridge to join the attack when she heard the sound that changed everything. The distinctive whine of aircraft engines approaching from the east. The Germans had called in air support, and it was arriving just in time to turn the tide of battle. Two Messerschmitt fighters roared overhead, their engines drowning out the sound of small arms fire from the battle below. They circled once to assess the situation, then began their attack runs, diving toward the partisan positions with machine guns blazing. The fighters were older models, probably diverted from some other mission, but they were still deadly against unprotected infantry. Maria watched in horror as the first strafing run caught 3 partisan fighters in the open, cutting them down before they could reach cover. The second fighter targeted the building where several partisans had taken shelter, its bullets chewing through the wooden walls like paper. In a matter of seconds, the tide of battle had shifted decisively against the resistance forces. But as the aircraft climbed for another attack run, Maria noticed something that gave her hope. The German command post was built around a fuel depot, with several large storage tanks positioned near the main building. The tanks were camouflaged and partially buried, but they were still visible from her elevated position. More importantly, they were connected to the main building by a series of fuel lines that fed generators and heating systems. If she could reach those fuel tanks and rupture them, the resulting explosion would destroy the entire German position. It would also kill anyone still inside the buildings, including any partisan fighters who might have penetrated the German defenses. But that was a risk she would have to take. Maria worked her way down the ridge as quickly as she dared, using the sound of aircraft engines to mask her movement. The German fighters were making their second attack run, concentrating their fire on the strongest partisan positions. She could see Dmitri's remaining fighters being forced to abandon their assault and seek cover in the surrounding forest. The fuel depot was located on the opposite side of the command post from the main battle, which meant Maria had to circle around the entire German position to reach it. She used every bit of fieldcraft she had learned, crawling through drainage ditches, hiding behind burnt-out vehicles, and timing her movements to coincide with the noise of the ongoing battle. She reached the edge of the fuel depot just as the German fighters began their third attack run. The storage tanks were even larger than they had appeared from the ridge, each one containing thousands of gallons of aviation fuel intended to support German air operations in the region. The fuel lines were protected by concrete channels, but they were accessible if she could find the right access point. Maria located a maintenance shed near the largest tank, equipped with tools and spare parts for the fuel system. Among the equipment, she found what she was looking for: a valve assembly that controlled fuel flow to the main building. If she could open this valve while simultaneously creating an ignition source, the resulting explosion would be visible from orbit. The problem was timing. She needed to coordinate her sabotage with the withdrawal of any surviving partisan fighters, assuming any were still alive inside the German positions. But she had no way to communicate with Dmitri's team, and the sounds of battle made it impossible to determine exactly what was happening. As Maria prepared her improvised demolition, she heard a new sound that made her blood run cold: the rumble of heavy vehicles approaching from the east. German reinforcements were arriving, probably a full company of infantry with armored support. Within minutes, any partisan fighters still in the area would be surrounded and annihilated. She made her decision. Maria opened the fuel valve all the way, releasing a stream of aviation fuel that began spreading across the ground around the storage tanks. The vapors were immediately visible in the cold air, and the smell was overpowering. She had perhaps minutes before the fuel concentration became dangerous, even without an ignition source. Working with desperate speed, Maria rigged an improvised delay mechanism using materials from the maintenance shed. A candle from the German supplies, positioned to ignite fuel-soaked rags after burning for several minutes. It wasn't sophisticated, but it would give her time to reach minimum safe distance before the explosion. As she lit the candle and began her retreat, Maria caught a glimpse of movement near the main building. A group of figures was emerging from a side entrance, moving carefully but quickly toward the forest. She recognized Dmitri's distinctive silhouette among them, along with what appeared to be several German prisoners. The partisan fighters had succeeded in their primary mission. They had captured or killed the German command staff, seized valuable intelligence, and were now withdrawing under cover of the approaching darkness. The air support and reinforcements had arrived too late to save the command post, though they might still prevent the complete escape of the attacking force. Maria ran through the forest as if her life depended on it, which it probably did. Behind her, the candle continued its steady burn, bringing inevitable destruction closer with each passing second. She needed to put as much distance as possible between herself and the fuel depot before the improvised timer reached its conclusion. She had covered perhaps half a mile when the world exploded behind her. The initial detonation of the fuel tanks was followed immediately by a series of secondary explosions as ammunition stores and vehicle fuel systems added their own contributions to the conflagration. The sound was indescribable, like thunder and earthquake, and the end of the world all rolled into one devastating moment. The shockwave knocked Maria flat, sending her tumbling down a small embankment to land in a heap at the bottom. Her ears were ringing, her vision was blurred, and she could taste blood in her mouth. But she was alive, which was more than could be said for anyone who had been within a quarter-mile of the German command post when it disintegrated. As her senses gradually returned, Maria became aware of a new sound: the roar of flames consuming everything combustible in the vicinity of the explosion. She climbed back up the embankment and looked back toward the German position, or what remained of it. Where the command post had stood, there was now a crater, surrounded by burning debris scattered across several acres of forest. The main building had simply vanished, along with the fuel depot, the communication center, and anything else within the blast radius. The explosion had been so powerful that it had shattered windows in the surrounding villages and was probably visible from the neighboring county. But more importantly, from a strategic standpoint, the explosion had destroyed the entire German command structure for the region. Oberst Müller and his staff were dead, along with their communication equipment, intelligence files, and operational plans. The reinforcements that had been rushing to support the command post now had no one to report to and no orders to follow. Maria began working her way toward the predetermined rendezvous point, where she hoped to meet surviving partisan fighters. The forest was alive with the sound of German vehicles and confused shouting as enemy forces tried to figure out what had happened and how to respond. But without their command structure, their response would be uncoordinated and largely ineffective. She found Dmitri and 5 surviving members of his team at a hidden camp 3 miles from the explosion site. They had successfully captured 2 German staff officers and a treasure trove of intelligence documents before the command post was destroyed. Combined with the intelligence Maria had gathered throughout the day, the partisans now possessed enough information to cripple German operations throughout the entire region. Pavel's team had also succeeded in their mission, ambushing the supply convoy and capturing enough weapons and ammunition to equip a company of partisan fighters. More importantly, they had eliminated the convoy's security detail and destroyed vehicles carrying critical supplies to German forward positions. As the surviving partisan fighters gathered around a small fire to share their stories of the day's victories, Maria found herself at the center of attention in a way that felt both uncomfortable and strangely appropriate. Her actions had made all the other successes possible, turning what should have been a desperate defensive action into a devastating offensive victory. The intelligence she had captured revealed the full extent of German weaknesses in the region. They were severely undermanned, demoralized by increasing partisan activity, and dependent on a command structure that she had just obliterated. More importantly, the collaborator list would allow the partisans to eliminate the intelligence network that had been their greatest vulnerability. Within hours, the effects of the day's actions began to ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. German garrisons throughout the region found themselves cut off from higher command, unsure of their orders, and facing a partisan force that seemed to know their every move. Several isolated units surrendered without firing a shot. Others simply abandoned their positions and retreated toward more defensible areas. The woman who had started the morning as a simple villager bringing food to hungry fighters had ended it as the architect of one of the most complete military disasters in German occupation history. An entire division's worth of enemy forces had been rendered combat ineffective by the actions of a single person, armed with nothing more than determination, intelligence, and her grandmother's kitchen knife. But Maria knew that the war was far from over. The Germans would respond to this defeat by bringing in fresh troops and adopting harsher measures against the civilian population. The easy victories would become harder to achieve, and the price of resistance would continue to climb. Still, for one night at least, the partisan fighters could celebrate a victory that proved resistance was not only possible, but devastatingly effective. The psychological impact of the day's events would spread far beyond the immediate military consequences, inspiring other resistance groups and demonstrating to occupied populations throughout the region that their oppressors were not invincible. As Maria sat by the fire, cleaning her grandmother's knife and planning for tomorrow's battles, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in the span of a single day. She had discovered capacities within herself that she had never suspected, crossed moral boundaries she had never imagined crossing, and accepted responsibilities that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. The frightened seamstress who had set out that morning with a bag of bread and cheese no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, more dangerous, and absolutely committed to driving the German occupiers from her homeland. The war had forged her into a weapon as deadly as any rifle or grenade, and she intended to use that weapon until either the enemy was defeated or she was dead. The flames crackled and danced in the darkness, throwing shifting shadows across the faces of the surviving fighters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight belonged to them. They had struck a blow that would be remembered long after the war ended, and they had done it with courage, cunning, and the unbreakable determination of people fighting for their very survival. Maria pulled her coat tighter against the cold and began planning her next mission. The Germans had underestimated her once. She intended to make sure they never made that mistake again. She was just bringing supplies. The next day, she obliterated the enemy's main force.